This morning was more rewriting of the stories that I had already thought were finished. In this case, I was just reworking a story that I had wrapped up back in February and had sent it off to a few lit mags and got basically all rejections. Admittedly, this is probably the one story of the collection that I have submitted probably the least. And it also was the story that actually needed probably the most refinement. It still wasn't much. It was still kind of a fair amount, just a kind of a minor amount. But there definitely was some element of refinement that was needed, specifically with just some of the sentences. So some of the sentences that I had there they were a bit clunky. And what I did was basically went through and made them more economical. Now, one of the things to understand is that when you write a story and you finish it, even if it's, especially with short stories, if you come back to it months later, it is going to read different to you than when you had first written it. The reason for that is simply the style that you're writing at the time will probably not be a style that you are as fond of when you go back to it. In my case, when I had written the story originally, I wanted it to use a lot of longer sentences, and I used a lot of ing verbs. So I peppered a lot of those in. Everything had an action. Everything had an action, So what I did this time was I went through, and a lot of the sentences that were longer, I actually just chopped up into smaller sentences, and basically started getting rid of a lot of those ing verbs as well. If I kept it the way it was, it would have read fine. Like, people could still read it and understand it. But I think me doing that makes it a much more pleasant experience for the reader. And it's again just an example of what distance can do. It's not time away is not so much about finding your mistakes with a clear view, like with a clear eye. It's about going back and making stronger judgment calls on your piece. It's having emotional distance from your work and seeing it with more of an objective view of what others might view it as and what others might prefer, and then making those decisions. I think often we make choices that are more for us and less for a reader, and we don't do it out of a sense of, I'm the artist, I'll do it any way I want. I think we do it often out of a sense of not realizing it. We just don't know. We do the story in a certain way because we think it's really entertaining, because for us it is, right? We wouldn't write it, we wouldn't call it finished if we didn't find the story to be entertaining, if it wasn't saying what we wanted it to say, at least to some degree. But I think we tend to get wrapped up in that and assuming that others will read the work in the same way and like that same sort of style. And when you go back and you look at it after some time away, you start to realize that let's do a different style. Let's try this other thing out here. Maybe it's not what we envisioned originally, but it's a much better way of telling the same tale, and the story itself, at the heart of it, will not change. The story will be the same. You're never the same person you are when you go back to your stories. I've mentioned this before, but it's so true. When you go to your second draft after doing your first draft of a novel, you're not the same person. Time goes by. We as human beings grow, and it does seem, I don't know if this is true just because of things like social media and information being more available, I don't know, but it does seem like we experience, I think, more change and more kind of character growth, for good or bad, I suppose, at a much faster rate than I've seen perhaps other generations do that. Or maybe it's all misconception. Maybe it's just because I'm now, moving into closer to middle adulthood, and I'm just experiencing what everyone else experiences. I'm just noticing it maybe for the first time, what have you. And so, for me, this was a very interesting realization that you can go back to your stories after a time away and see something completely differently and have it mean something very, very different for you. And I don't think it's ever a problem. I think it only becomes a problem when you take so long to draft out a story or to get like some version of the story done that you are never able to really finish it. That you spend 3 years working on the first draft of a story and it never gets done because the person you were when you started the story and the things you wanted to explore, the themes and ideas you wanted to express in the story at the start of it, in 3 years, it doesn't hold as much meaning to you. It doesn't hold the sort of grip over your life that it did at the start of it. And if you're experiencing that in the middle of a draft, in the middle of completing some version of your work, that's where I think you can get into a ton of trouble. I noticed that with critique partners. I've had a critique partner that for I think over 3 years they've worked only one story. It's just been one story that they've done. It was the first time working with them, so they've only ever done the story. And I remember them going through it and constantly being stuck on the same draft for, God, it was at least a couple of years. They eventually ended up self-publishing their work now. It's done, but I mean, it was like 2 years of like redoing this first draft because they couldn't figure out what they wanted to explore and what they wanted the story to be about, what have you. Fortunately, it took them about a year to revise it and get it out there, which is awesome. But man, that's a lot of spinning. There was a lot of spinning their wheels, and I think it was because they could never get one draft completed because what they wanted to explore at the start of it was not what they wanted to explore at the end of it. The ideas they wanted to express were not the same. Their way of telling the tale just changed. They were thinking about maybe doing it a different way, trying a different form, all that stuff. And again, it's natural because you change, because you as a person change. Your ideas, your insights, how you want to do things changes. But you've got to have some sort of blueprint. It's you've got to have. It's like putting a puzzle together. All right, you usually you have the box of the puzzle, in front of you so you can use it. That's kind of what your drafts are. And man, if you're constantly changing your mind here and taking so long to get it done that you can't have a consistent tale told, no matter how bad it is, at least be consistent with it. These things never get done. And so, as much as I take my time with this, I say this again, these stories do need to be done at least draft-wise. You have to get your drafts done within a reasonable time frame, so you don't start spinning your wheels, you don't start kind of losing your momentum. And everyone's different. There are some people I'm sure that can be very, very focused on telling the same sort of story for years and not change, and that's awesome. But I think for a lot of us, myself included especially, after like 6 months, a year, you don't really want to do the same thing. You sort of want to retell a different tale. You sort of want to do things in a different way. And what keeps you on track is having that draft, so you can kind of at least see what you've done before and at least go off that. So you're not going back to the beginning and reworking that and getting stuck and never making any kind of progress. Yeah. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to wrap up. I'll see you all tomorrow. Again, I appreciate you watching this. Hopefully, fingers crossed, about a week or so from now, I might have my novel back. contacting the editor, and we can dive headfirst into getting this thing reworked so I can finally start making some progress in the self-publishing process. And so thank you so much for watching this. I will see you all tomorrow.